It was my 75th birthday. I'd spent the morning the way I usually did, quietly, with my hands deep in something warm. The scent of cinnamon from the apple crumble lingered through the house like a kind memory, though there wasn't much laughter to catch it. The kitchen windows rattled a little in the breeze, and I pressed my palm against the glass, remembering when tiny fingerprints used to smudge that very spot. My grandchildren used to lean in, watching for their parents to arrive squealing every time a car pulled up the drive. But this morning there was only stillness, a kind of pause that didn't expect anything. Not anymore. I'd set the table myself, just 4 settings this year. I didn't bother with the good china. I used to polish it before every gathering, but today I chose the everyday plates. They do fine. I still made the effort, though. A table runner with faded embroidery, a vase of fresh-cut lilies from the garden, and the old candlesticks I used on special occasions, even if no one noticed them anymore. The thing is, I wasn't sad. Not at first. Not when I lit the candles, not when I checked the roast. There was a sort of numb pride in doing things properly, like muscle memory, like breathing. I'd spent a lifetime tending to birthdays, my children's, my husband's, even the dog's once. I made sure everyone felt seen, wrapped gifts in tissue and twine, wrote little poems and birthday cards. I always cared enough for all of us. But this year I noticed it, the ache in my knees as I leaned to retrieve a dropped spoon, the hollowness in my chest when I realized I hadn't received a single phone call before noon. I looked at the mantelpiece. No cards, no flowers, just a dusty clock ticking forward, indifferent. That clock used to chime when we sang Happy Birthday. Now it just ticked, like a metronome for silence. When they finally arrived, it was almost 2. No apology, just chatter about traffic and how cold the weather had been lately. My daughter walked in first, her heels clicking against the tile, followed by her husband and their teenage girl, who didn't even look up from her phone. I greeted them with the kind of smile that has too much practice behind it, soft at the edges, but hollow in the center. My granddaughter gave me a quick hug, barely touching my arm, and mumbled something like Happy Birthday. Then they all sat down, coats still on, and began talking about someone at work who had been so dramatic, laughing, without even glancing at the table I had set. I asked if they wanted tea. No one responded, so I went to the kitchen and poured it anyway. As I stirred sugar into their cups, I thought about the early years when my daughter would draw me crayon hearts and tape wildflowers to construction paper. I still had some of them in a box in the attic. She used to tell me I was her hero. Now she barely made eye contact. I brought the tea over, and that's when I noticed the bag. It was plastic, one of those cheap, glossy gift bags from the drugstore, the kind with crooked foil letters and a bent handle. It sat beside my plate, like a forgotten obligation. I picked it up slowly, almost hoping there was some mistake, that it was meant for someone else. But no, my daughter nudged it toward me with a half smile. "Go ahead," she said. "Open it." Inside was a bottle of lotion, not even the kind I use, not even the brand I like. It was marked 70% off on the label, with a clearance sticker still half attached. And then, almost like she couldn't help herself, my daughter added, "Don't mind the packaging, it looked so cheap I almost didn't bother." They laughed, all of them. Even my granddaughter, like it was nothing, like I was nothing. And something in me, something that had curled and shriveled for years in silence, stirred. It didn't roar, it didn't scream, but it moved. A quiet shift, like a door creaking open at the back of an old house. I set the bag down. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I just nodded, as if I'd heard a truth I'd been avoiding all this time. And in that moment, I realized this birthday wasn't mine. It belonged to the version of me they expected, the one who didn't mind, the one who gave endlessly, the one who didn't need to feel seen. But that woman, she wasn't home anymore. The bag sat on the table like an afterthought, and I couldn't take my eyes off it. I stirred my tea slowly just to have something to do with my hands. But in truth, my heart wasn't in the tea nor in the roast still warming in the oven. My heart was in the silence that followed her laughter, the kind of silence that feels less like quiet and more like being erased. I picked up the bottle again, not to admire it, but to really look at it. The brand was something I'd never buy for myself, too strong a scent, too thin in texture. It was the kind of thing you'd find on the clearance shelf behind the seasonal candles, something someone grabs at the last minute to avoid showing up empty-handed. Not a gift, a placeholder, a gesture without thought. She didn't notice the way I handled it, how I turned it over without a word. She was already talking about their trip to the coast, some resort with a spa and a saltwater pool. Her husband interrupted with a joke about how old people love lavender, and I watched as my granddaughter laughed with her nose still buried in her phone. Not one of them saw the look on my face. Not one of them noticed how still I had gone. They say that when you get older you become invisible. I never believed that until that day. They stayed for an hour, maybe less. Ate the roast I made without a word of praise, pushed the carrots to the side, like children left their empty glasses for me to clean. When they stood to leave, my daughter kissed the top of my head like I was some little doll on a shelf. Then she said, "Thanks for lunch, Mom. Next year, maybe we'll go out instead. Make it easier for you." She didn't say it kindly. She said it like I'd made too much of a fuss, like the napkins I'd ironed, or the cake I'd baked were some sort of burden I had forced on them. After they left, I sat alone with the remains of the meal. Forks askew, a napkin stained with lipstick, my plate still half full. I stared at the empty seat across from me, the one where my husband used to sit. He would have noticed. He always noticed. If the tea was too strong, if I looked tired, if my smile didn't reach my eyes. He wasn't perfect, but he saw me. That was enough. Sometimes it was everything. Now there was just the echo of footsteps down the front walk, the muffled sound of an engine starting, and then nothing. No laughter, no voices, just the tick of that old clock again, and the soft hum of the refrigerator. I got up slowly. My knees don't like sudden movements these days. I cleared the table, rinsed the plates, wrapped the leftovers even though I knew I wouldn't eat them. I moved automatically like I always do. But something had cracked open in me, and it was too quiet now to pretend I hadn't heard it. I went into the living room and sat on the couch with the gift bag in my lap. The television was off. I didn't want the noise. I just wanted to feel what I was feeling, to let it settle into my bones. I thought of all the birthdays I'd remembered, each cake, each party, each surprise. I'd never missed one. I'd driven across the city in the rain for them. I'd sold jewelry to buy toys when money was tight. I'd lied to my own mother to make an excuse for missing her dinner, just so I could attend theirs. But today, when it was my turn, they came empty. They came rushed. They came with a plastic bag and a careless joke. And what stung wasn't the cheapness of the gift. It was the cheapness of the thought behind it. The way they showed up because it was expected, not because they wanted to. The way their eyes glanced past me like I was just another piece of old furniture in a house they'd outgrown. I held the bottle up to the light. Its contents shimmered syrupy and fake. I thought to myself, this is exactly what they gave me today. Something shiny on the outside, hollow and thin inside. No warmth, no care, just enough to get by. My fingers clenched around it, not out of anger, out of a kind of deep, weary realization. This was never about the lotion. It was never about the gift. It was about everything they didn't say, everything they no longer saw in me, everything they stopped honoring. I placed the bottle gently on the side table. Then I went into the laundry room, and took off my apron. I hung it on its usual hook, and I stood there alone staring at the fabric, as if it still held all the moments I'd worn it for birthday breakfasts, Christmas dinners, sick days, and snowstorms. It was more than cloth. It was service. It was love, made visible. But love, when ignored long enough, folds itself away. Later that night, after the dishes were washed and the lights were dimmed, I climbed the stairs slower than usual. Each step creaked beneath me, a familiar song of age and quiet. The house always feels larger after people leave, as though their absence expands the air. I passed the hallway where once on birthdays balloons used to dangle from doorways, and little hands would run through them, squealing with delight. Now the walls were bare, the silence untouched. I paused outside the guest room, used to be my daughter's room when she was young. I had painted it lavender when she turned 13. She told me it was too babyish then, but I remember her falling asleep with a smile that night. That was back when she still asked me to braid her hair back when she needed me, and wasn't embarrassed by it. I walked on my hand, tracing the railing like it held memories I could still catch if I just moved slow enough. In my bedroom, I sat at the edge of the bed and opened the drawer in the nightstand. The lamp cast a soft glow on the letterhead tucked inside a folded legal document, cream paper, heavy ink. My will. It had been written years ago, back when the grandchildren were little, when I believed that inheritance was something you passed down simply because you shared blood. I held it between my fingers like it was something fragile, but it wasn't, not anymore. I'd once imagined this paper as a last gesture of love, a way to ensure they knew even after I was gone that I'd been thinking of them, that they mattered, that they were seen. But tonight all I saw was the truth they no longer saw me. There is something so lonely in being useful but not cherished. They come for dinner. They accept the gifts. They smile just enough. But their eyes, they're somewhere else. On their phones. On their next vacation. On what they can't wait to do when they leave this house. They used to cling to my legs. They used to cry when they had to go. I set the will down gently and opened the window beside my bed. The air was crisp, smelling faintly of garden soil and something sweet. Maybe the pear tree had begun to bloom. I closed my eyes and breathed it in long and slow. That smell reminded me of the spring my husband built the trellis, the one I still hang wind chimes from. We'd eaten picnic lunches under that tree. I remember thinking, this is enough. This is everything. But seasons change. Trees still bloom even if no one's looking. And people, they forget. I stayed by the window for a long time, watching nothing in particular, just the shadows shifting in the yard. But inside I was moving. My thoughts were no longer soft. They were shaping themselves into something firm. I thought about all the birthdays I had funded, spa vouchers, gaming consoles, weekends away, gifts that required budgeting planning, sometimes sacrifice. And what had I received in return? A bottle of discount lotion in a plastic bag and a comment so sharp it might as well have been meant to cut. Don't mind the packaging, it looked so cheap I almost didn't bother. Almost didn't bother. She said it like I was meant to laugh along, like I was in on the joke, like I hadn't spent the last 2 weeks knitting a scarf with my aching hands for her daughter, like I hadn't spent my entire adult life bothering to show up, bothering to remember, bothering to care. I turned back toward the nightstand and opened the drawer again. My hand hesitated over the pen, not out of doubt, but out of reverence. It felt like I was closing a chapter, something sacred. I didn't cross anything out yet. I just sat there and stared at the list of names. Names I had once written with pride, with hope. But hope requires nurture, and pride wilts in silence. I thought of something my mother once told me: you don't owe the ungrateful your legacy. At the time, I didn't understand her. I thought she was being bitter, but now I saw the wisdom in her words. She'd lived through enough winters to know that some trees don't bear fruit, no matter how long you tend them. I set the will aside and looked around the room. Framed photos of smiling faces stared back at me from decades past. But the people in those pictures no longer existed. They had grown into strangers with my eyes and my blood, but not my heart. The question burned quietly in my chest. If they can't value you when you're alive, why reward them once you're gone? It wasn't vengeance. I wasn't angry. I was just done. Done pretending that proximity was love. Done giving just to be forgotten. Done pouring from a cup no one ever thought to refill. The morning after my birthday, I moved differently. Not slower, not faster, just different. I wasn't rushing to tidy up or to prepare for someone else's arrival or to make excuses for someone else's neglect. I moved like someone who was finally listening to the silence and letting it say what it needed to say. The dishes still sat in the drying rack. I left them there. The plastic gift bag was still on the side table. I didn't touch it. I just walked past these things, like walking through a house after a storm, noticing what stayed upright and what had fallen over. I sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and watched the steam rise. It curled like a question, slow and twisting, vanishing before it reached anything solid. I used to find comfort in that steam. Now I watched it disappear and wondered how many of my years had done the same, risen from love, from effort, from intention, and vanished into rooms where no one was paying attention. By noon, I found myself opening drawers, not looking for anything in particular, maybe looking for myself. I ran my fingers across old receipts, warranty cards for appliances, long gone, birthday cards I'd kept because they once made me cry. I found one from my daughter, her handwriting still round and hopeful. To the best mommy in the whole world, I hope I grow up to be just like you. I stared at that sentence for a long time. Somewhere along the way, something broke, not just in her, but in us. I remembered her as a girl, quiet but kind. She used to run to me after school and tell me about her day with all the animation of someone who believed their every thought mattered. I used to kneel to her level and say, "Tell me everything." And she did. For years she did. Until one day she didn't anymore. I don't remember the last time she really told me anything. Not the way she used to. Not the way that made me feel like the center of her world, even for a minute. I kept that card on the table and sat with it, hands folded, as though it were a guest more welcome than the ones who had come yesterday. That afternoon I picked up the scarf I had knitted. It was still folded neatly in a gift box, lavender wool, soft and warm, made from the yarn I'd unraveled from an old honeymoon blanket I couldn't bear to throw away. I had poured hours into it. I'd chosen the pattern to match my granddaughter's favorite coat, the one I noticed she wore at Christmas. I thought maybe she would see the care, the love stitched into every row. But she hadn't even opened it. Her mother had made a face when she saw the box. "You still knit," she'd said, as if I had offered her a piece of the past no one wanted anymore. I sat there and held the scarf to my face. It still smelled like lavender, my sachets from the linen drawer. It still carried warmth and meaning and history, but it hadn't been seen, and maybe that's what hurt the most. Not the rejection, but the indifference. Later that day, I took out the donation box from the hall closet. I folded the scarf, gently wrapped it in tissue, and placed it inside. Maybe someone in need would wear it and feel loved. Someone who didn't expect it. someone who would be warmed not just by wool, but by the idea that someone had cared enough to make something by hand. It gave me peace in a way, to know that it wouldn't sit in the corner of someone's house unopened, unappreciated, forgotten. I sat down that evening and pulled the will out once more. This time I turned to the second page, the one with names and allocations. I read them slowly, one by one, like I was reading prayers I no longer believed in. My daughter, my son-in-law, my granddaughter. Each name felt heavier than the one before it, not because of what they meant, but because of what they no longer did. I could remember exactly why I included each of them, what moment of tenderness or shared history had earned them a place in that document, but those moments were long gone. And love. Love does not mean staying loyal to a version of someone that no longer exists. So I took the pen, the black one I always used for important things. I drew a single careful line through the first name, then the second, then the third. I didn't cry. I didn't feel vengeful. I felt clean. There was a quiet power in that moment, a strange kind of dignity, like I was reclaiming a part of myself that had been locked in the attic of my own heart. And once the ink had dried, I folded the will again, tucked it back into the envelope, and wrote a new date on the front. That night I slept better than I had in years. When I woke the next morning, the sun had already filled the bedroom. It came through the curtains without asking permission, golden and warm, touching the old wallpaper, like a memory too stubborn to fade. I lay there for a long time, just listening to the house breathe around me. The low hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the whisper of leaves brushing the window, the slow stretch of wood and time. There was no rush to get up, no appointments, no guests, no reason to set the table or fuss with my hair. And in that quiet I realized something I hadn't dared admit before I was alone, but I wasn't lonely. Not in the way I had been yesterday. Not in the way I had been surrounded by people who made me feel like furniture. Alone can be sharp, but it can also be soft, like the quiet after a storm or the hush of snow falling. That morning it was soft, soft enough to hold, soft enough to trust. I made my way downstairs, careful with the railing. My knees ached a little more than usual, but my spine felt straighter. I brewed tea not for company, not for tradition, but for myself. I chose the good mug, the one with the small crack in the handle and the gold trim faded from years of washing, the one I always used on days when I needed reminding that something broken could still be beautiful. I took my tea to the front porch and sat on the swing. The garden was still wet from dew, the flowers shy, but ready to bloom. I sipped slowly, and for the first time in years, I let my mind wander toward the people who weren't family, but had shown up like they were. There was Marta, the woman from down the street who brought me a peach cobbler last winter, when she heard I had the flu. She didn't knock, just left it on the porch with a note that said, "Hope this warms your bones." She had nothing to gain, and yet she gave. There was also Helen, my nurse from the recovery center, after I had my hip surgery. She stayed an extra hour every night just to read to me when I couldn't sleep. I never asked her to. She just did. We talked about books and gardens and the small things that make life feel bearable. I think she reminded me of myself before everything became about being useful to others. And then there was Leonard, my late husband's old friend. He still called once a month just to check in. He didn't say much, but his voice always carried something rare presence, the kind that didn't need noise to make itself known. As I rocked on the porch, I thought of those three not related by blood, not listed in my will, and I felt a tug inside me, a question gentle and patient. Why shouldn't they inherit what love built simply because they dared to show up? I went inside and retrieved the will again, this time with the weight of clarity. I made space. I added Marta's name, I added Helen's name, I added Leonard's name. Not because they had done grand things, but because they had done small things, with sincerity, with grace, with heart. They had seen me, not as an obligation or a relic, but as a person, a woman, a story still unfolding. When I looked at the document again, it didn't just feel cleaner, it felt true. After sealing the envelope, I placed it in the drawer beneath my mother's old quilt, the same quilt I was born under, the same one I wrapped my daughter in when she came home from the hospital. So much softness, so much effort to keep others warm. It felt right somehow to let that quilt hold the new truth, to let the legacy sleep beside the fabric of my beginnings. That afternoon, the phone rang. It was my daughter. Her voice was brisk. She wanted to know if I still had the charger she left behind. No mention of my birthday. No thank you for the dinner. Not even a passing apology for her remark. Just if it's not too much trouble, could you drop it off? I looked at the phone for a long moment before answering, and when I did, my voice was steady and low. No, I said simply, you'll need to come get it. There was a pause on her end, surprised perhaps, maybe even a little irritated. But I didn't fill the silence. I didn't apologize or explain. I let the quiet hang there, like a curtain drawn on an old play. Okay, she finally said. I'll see if I can come by next week. And I said, take your time. But what I meant was, there's nothing here waiting for you anymore. After I hung up, I stood at the window, tea in hand, and watched the light fall across the rug I'd woven when I was 32. It was faded now, threadbare in spots, but still whole, still mine. It struck me then that I had spent so many years weaving warmth for others, stitching comfort into their lives, hoping one day they would notice the pattern I made just for them. But now I was learning to make something for myself. The days that followed carried a new kind of stillness, not empty, just quiet, like a room after music has ended when the notes still hang in the air, invisible but known. I didn't rush to fill the space anymore. I let it breathe. I let myself breathe. I started doing little things I hadn't done in years, not for anyone else, but for the sheer act of remembering I was still alive in my own story. I opened the sewing cabinet, the one I used to guard like a treasure chest when the children were young. I ran my fingers over the spools of thread, the fabric scraps, the needles that had once mended everything from doll clothes to torn school pants. I chose a piece of soft cotton rose-colored with faint floral print and began hand-stitching a small pouch. No purpose to it, no recipient, just the act of making. And as I pulled the thread through the cloth loop by loop, I felt something unfamiliar pleasure. Not pride, not productivity, just the joy of creating something for the sake of it. Not to earn approval, not to be seen, just because I still could. That night I sat in the garden under the soft hum of the porch light. The wind was gentle, and the scent of jasmine curled around my shoulders like an old friend. I rocked in my chair and closed my eyes, listening not to words, but to the whisper of the leaves, the soft creak of wood, the pulse of my own breathing. I didn't need anyone to talk to. I wasn't lonely. I was in my own company, and for the first time in a long while, that was enough. I thought again of the scarf. I had wondered if giving it to charity had been impulsive. But no, it was right. It deserved to be worn by someone who'd feel its warmth with gratitude. I imagined a woman walking home in the cold, the wool snug around her neck, thinking someone must have loved me enough to make this. And in a way, I had. It was strange to feel freer by giving less. For so long I had believed that my role in the family was to be the anchor to hold things together, to absorb the tension, to carry the weight in silence. I had given my time, my savings, my health, my rest, my dignity in pieces, all of it stitched into family dinners, Christmases, emergency babysitting, birthday envelopes full of cash. But giving without acknowledgement slowly carves a hollow in you, and eventually, if you're not careful, that hollow becomes a home where resentment lives. I had never wanted to be bitter. Bitterness rots the fruit before it's even picked. But truth was different. Truth was clarity. And now that I'd tasted it, I couldn't pretend not to know the flavor. They had taken and taken until I mistook depletion for devotion. And I let them. I let them because I thought that's what love was supposed to be, unconditional. But unconditional love doesn't mean unconditional access. It doesn't mean enduring mockery or being treated like a relic that just happens to make good meatloaf. I was tired of performing gratitude for those who only gave me presents out of duty. That week I began to sort through my belongings. Not in the grim end-of-life way that some people do when they age, but in a curative way. A reclamation. I opened the cedar chest in my room, the one that held decades of keepsakes, baby shoes, wedding letters, faded Polaroids. I held each item in my hand like it was a conversation. I let the memories rise, then I let them go. I began separating what mattered from what didn't, not just in objects, but in people. And when I came to the photo albums, I paused. My hands lingered on one page, in particular my daughter's 30th birthday. We had hosted it in the backyard. I'd baked 3 cakes because she couldn't decide on a flavor. I remember her hugging me and saying, "You're the only one who ever goes all out for me, Mom." She had tears in her eyes when she said it. I believed them. And now I wondered when that version of her had disappeared, when the warmth had cooled, when the laughter turned hollow, when the affection became an expectation, and then nothing at all. I closed the album gently. People change, that's not a betrayal, but pretending they haven't, that is. Later that afternoon, I received a letter in the mail, not a bill, not junk, an actual letter from Helen, the nurse. Inside was a card with a painted sunflower on the front. Her handwriting was neat, slanted to the right, full of care. "Dear Mrs. Ellis, I was just thinking of you the other day when I passed a lavender bush in bloom. It reminded me of your scarf. I still wear it, you know, especially on the days when I need something soft and steady around me. I hope you're keeping warm too. With love, Helen." I sat on the porch and cried, not out of sadness, but out of the pure grace of being remembered. That scarf, that gesture, had found a home. And so it seemed, had I. Not in their eyes, but in the spaces where I had truly been seen. That letter from Helen stayed on my kitchen table for days. I read it over and over, each time slower than the last, letting every word settle in places that had long been starved of kindness. There was something sacred about being remembered without prompting, about being thought of not because someone had to, but because they wanted to. The scarf I had given her hadn't been fancy. It wasn't bought from a boutique or wrapped in foil and ribbons. It had been soft, practical, handmade, just like me. And in her letter, Helen hadn't just thanked me. She had seen me, seen the care, the tenderness, the intention behind something that most would overlook. I thought about that scarf and how it had warmed someone who appreciated it, and I couldn't help but contrast that with what had happened on my birthday. The dismissiveness, the laughter, the way my daughter had looked at me when she said the scarf looked like something from a dollar bin. No attempt to understand what it meant, no desire to. Just a joke made of something sacred. But it wasn't the joke that hurt the most. It was that no one had corrected her. Not her husband, not her daughter. They had laughed. As if mocking me was a sport they all agreed to play, and I was too old to catch the ball. That silence of complicity that was the wound that festered. And yet, that letter on my table was a balm, a reminder that I wasn't invisible to everyone, that perhaps the deepest parts of me, the ones that give that men that create beauty from scraps, weren't lost. They just needed a new audience, one that knew the value of quiet love. That afternoon, I returned to the drawer where I had placed the will. I unfolded it again, running my hand across the ink, as if it might pulse beneath my fingertips. The lines I had drawn through those names were still there, bold and unapologetic. But it wasn't just about removing them. It was about making room for what mattered. I pulled out a clean sheet of paper, just a loose leaf from the pad I keep for grocery lists, and began writing. If you are reading this, then I am no longer here to explain myself, so let this letter speak for me. I have lived a long life full of joy, sorrow, love, and disappointment. I gave freely and often, and for many years I thought that was enough. I believed that showing up, giving my time and energy and heart would be remembered, that it would matter. But I have learned something in these last few months. Giving without being seen is a kind of slow erasure. It wears you down until you are a ghost in your own life. I do not wish to leave behind resentment or bitterness. That is not my legacy. What I leave behind must reflect who I truly am, not who others assumed me to be. I paused there, letting the ink dry. The words felt like a kind of reckoning. Not with them, but with myself. I continued. To those who treated me like an obligation, who laughed at my efforts, who showed up only when they wanted something, I wish you no harm. I simply no longer wish to reward your absence with my presence even in death. And to those who listened, who offered warmth, who saw me even in my quietest hours, you have my gratitude and more. You have my trust. You are the ones who will carry forward what I leave behind, because you carried me when I wasn't asking to be held. Love, Mother. I folded the letter and placed it beside the will. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel smug. I felt aligned, like the house had finally stopped shifting beneath me. The next day, I called the lawyer's office to schedule a formal update. The young woman on the phone was kind, her voice crisp and efficient, but not rushed. She asked if I needed help coming in. I told her I could manage. And I could. I had already done the heavy lifting. Later that evening, I walked to the mailbox with the letter I planned to leave for the lawyer sealed simple, marked in my best handwriting. I placed it inside and lifted the red flag on the box. It clunked into place with a soft, decisive sound. As I turned back toward the house, I noticed something I hadn't seen in a while, my reflection in the front window. I stood there a moment studying her. She was older, yes, wrinkled, softer in some places, worn down in others, but there was something else. She looked solid, not invisible, not small, just whole. Inside the house, the plastic gift bag was still where I had left it. I walked over, picked it up, and carried it to the trash bin. Not angrily, not dramatically, just firmly. I placed it on top, closed the lid, and wiped my hands clean. I didn't even look back. A few days later, I went into town, not for groceries or errands, but because I wanted to feel the rhythm of life again. Not the family dinners or the rushed conversations, but the slower hum of strangers going about their day. There's something grounding about watching people move, each lost in their own little world. It reminds you that you don't need to be the center of anyone's orbit to be whole. I sat at my favorite cafe, the one tucked between the hardware store and the florist. It had a quiet corner table by the window, and the owner always played music from a record player, soft jazz, or old French ballads that felt like memories you didn't know you had. I ordered a tea and a slice of lemon cake, even though I rarely ate sweets anymore. I felt like indulging in something that was just for me. As I sat there watching people pass by, I found myself thinking not about what I had lost, but what I had endured, what I had survived. I had survived the slow erosion of recognition. I had survived the shift from being essential to being tolerated. That quiet exile that mothers experience when their usefulness fades, but their love is still expected unquestioned. I'd been grieving, I realized, not just the loss of tenderness from my daughter, or the indifference of my granddaughter, but the death of the role I had once poured myself into: mother, caretaker, provider. And maybe that's why the birthday moment hurt so deeply. It was not just a cheap gift. It was the burial of the last piece of that identity wrapped in plastic and presented with a smirk. But here in the cafe, with the hum of soft music and the warmth of tea in my hands, I began to feel the gentle rise of something new, something small but unmistakable self. Not the self I had performed for others, not the one who anticipated needs and tucked herself into corners of convenience, but the woman who stitched memories into scarves, who wrote letters in longhand, who still saw beauty in cracked teacups and storm-washed gardens. That woman had been there all along, waiting. After finishing my cake, I walked over to the florist. The bell above the door jingled softly as I entered. The air smelled of eucalyptus and rosewater, fresh soil, and green stems. I hadn't bought flowers for myself in years. It always felt indulgent, unnecessary. But today I did. I chose a bundle of freesia white and pale yellow. They reminded me of the bouquet my husband had brought home the day our daughter was born. They had filled the whole room with their perfume, a kind of holy joy. I paid in cash, tucked them under my arm, and walked home with their scent trailing behind me like a blessing. When I returned, I put them in a vase and placed them on the mantel. Not for guests, not for a celebration, just because this was my house and I was still here. That evening I pulled out the old photo albums again, but this time I didn't look for signs of betrayal or nostalgia that stung. I looked for her, the woman I used to be. I found her in the way she smiled at the camera, wide and unguarded. I found her in the notes she wrote in the margins: "Bake this pie with Mary, burn the crust," or "He wore that hideous sweater. I made him still laughed like a boy." I saw her, the giver, the dreamer, the woman who made a life out of what little she had and wrapped it all in warmth. And suddenly I felt protective of her. How dare they laugh at her? How dare they reduce her to a burden, a background figure, a source of gifts and food and silence? No, that woman deserved more. She deserved to be honored, and if no one else would do it, then I would. That night I wrote another letter, not for the will, not for any lawyer. This one was for myself. Dear me, you did the best you could. You gave and you gave and you gave again, not because you were weak, but because you believed in love. You believed that if you just held the family together, they'd notice, they'd value you. But even when they didn't, you kept going. That was strength, not foolishness. And now you've given enough. You don't owe them the rest of your heart. You don't have to stay small to be kind. From here on out, you give only to those who hold your gift with both hands. I folded the letter, placed it inside the back of my journal, and sealed it with a ribbon. Not for anyone else to find, just for me. Before bed, I moved through the house one more time, touching the back of chairs, smoothing the blanket on the couch, turning off each light with care. This home had held so much pain, so much sacrifice, but it had also held me quietly, patiently, until I was ready to return to myself. And tonight, for the first time in a long while, I didn't dread waking up alone. I looked forward to it. The next Sunday, my granddaughter called. Not her mother, just her. I almost didn't answer. The phone rang 4 times, and I stood there staring at it like it was a trick. But something in me said, "Take it. Hear her voice." So I did. She was quiet at first, not her usual clipped, distracted tone. Her voice had a weight in it I hadn't heard before. "Hi, Grandma," she said. I just wanted to say sorry for the other day, at your birthday." I didn't speak right away. I let the silence sit between us, not to punish her, but to let her words breathe. I wanted to know if she meant it, or if this was some polite push from her mother. She continued filling the quiet like a child confessing to a teacher. "I know we weren't nice. I was just tired and..." She stopped. Then she said something I didn't expect. "I didn't even open your gift. Mom said not to bother." And there it was. A small, sharp truth. Not dressed up, not softened. Just the truth. She hadn't been thoughtless by accident. She had been directed. I didn't feel anger. I didn't even feel hurt anymore. What I felt was clarity. "I made that scarf for you," I said gently, with yarn from something I loved. It wasn't expensive, but it came from somewhere real. "I know," she said. I figured it was something like that." I shouldn't have laughed. I heard her swallow on the other end. "I've been thinking about it, and I don't want to be like that." It was quiet again. I could have said many things. I could have scolded her or asked why she didn't stand up for me that day, but instead I said, "Then don't be." She sniffled. "Can I still have the scarf?" I looked toward the donation box. It had already been picked up 2 days ago. That scarf was gone to someone whose name I'd never know, but whose warmth I had prayed for. "No, sweetheart," I said, not unkindly. "It's already been given to someone who needed it, but maybe I can make you another one if I feel moved to." The pause on her end was longer this time. "I understand," she said. It was the first time I'd ever heard her speak without expectation. We ended the call on a soft note. No promises, no performative affection. Just a quiet, "I love you" from her, and a sincere "thank you for calling" from me. That was enough. Afterward, I sat on the porch again, my knitting needles in my lap. I didn't start a new scarf that day. I wasn't ready. But I ran the yarn through my fingers, slow and steady, and thought about how many threads a relationship could hold before it frayed entirely. Sometimes it's not a dramatic break. Sometimes it's just a slow unraveling, one careless tug at a time. A joke here, a missed thank you there, the absence of eye contact, the failure to remember the flavor of someone's tea. And before you know it, the tapestry you spent years weaving has holes in it you can't patch. But sometimes, if you're lucky, a single thread can still be salvaged. I didn't think my granddaughter had become her mother, not yet. But I saw now how easy it was to drift into that role, how seamless it is to inherit not just genetics, but tone, attitude, apathy. That phone call, it wasn't redemption, but it was a tug on the loose thread pulling gently in the opposite direction. It gave me something small a choice, whether or not to meet her there, whether or not to leave the door cracked just enough to let in a breeze. The next day I opened the hallway closet. In the back, behind the linen sheets and winter coats, was a basket of yarn I'd been saving. Not lavender this time, but soft rose and cream. Feminine, warm. I pulled them out and set them on the kitchen table, unsure of what I would do with them yet. Then I made myself a simple lunch, a tomato sandwich and a pear. I ate it slowly, deliberately. For years, meals had been events for others, prepared, plated, served, cleaned. But now I was relearning how to feed myself, and not just with food. Later, I sat by the radio and listened to an old classical station. A cello piece came on slow, mournful, beautiful, in a way that reminded me of quiet things. Late nights rocking a sick child, rain tapping softly on a tin roof, the moment after laughter when everyone is still smiling, but no longer speaking. I closed my eyes and let it wash over me. This was what it meant to age, I realized. Not to grow smaller, but to grow inward, to gather yourself from the places you left yourself behind. That night I lit a single candle before bed, not out of ritual, just because the room looked softer that way. I didn't need to explain it to anyone. No one needed to approve, because for the first time in decades, I was living inside my own life. The next week passed with a quiet steadiness that felt almost like healing. Not the grand, cinematic kind of healing where music swells and tears fall, but the subtle sort that lives in ordinary moments. Like walking into a room and no longer feeling dread, or pouring tea and realizing your hands aren't trembling, or waking up and not immediately bracing for disappointment. I began rearranging the house not to impress anyone, not for spring cleaning, just to let things breathe. I moved the side table closer to the window, where the sun was stronger, and set the vase of fading freesias right on top. They were beginning to wilt, petals curling like secrets, but they still filled the room with that tender, sweet scent. I didn't throw them out. I let them fade naturally. Some things deserve to take their time leaving. In the living room, I pulled the old family photos down from the walls, not out of anger, but out of clarity. I wrapped each frame in cloth and stored them gently in the hall closet. They weren't gone. They just didn't belong on the walls anymore. The people in those pictures had drifted. Their images were frozen in time, smiling at a version of me who hadn't yet learned what I knew now. Instead, I hung a small painting I'd once found at a thrift market, an old oil portrait of a woman in profile, quiet and solemn, her gaze turned slightly upward. I'd always liked her expression, resolved, as though she had made peace with something long ago. I wanted her in the room with me. I began reading again, too, real reading. Not just newspapers or church bulletins or cookbooks, but novel stories where women wandered and found themselves or lost everything and discovered they were still whole. I spent afternoons on the porch with those pages, letting their words stitch something back together in me. And every now and then I would hear from someone unexpected. Leonard called one morning, his voice low and slow as always. "I was thinking about that soup you made last winter," he said. "The one with lentils and sausage. I've been craving it." I chuckled. "I don't remember giving you the recipe." "You didn't," he said. But the memory's strong enough, I thought I'd try guessing. He paused before continuing. "How are you doing?" That question, the way he asked it, unrushed, unassumptive. It was like an open gate on a garden path. I didn't need to explain everything. I just said, "Better, quieter, but better." "I'm glad," he replied. "I think about you more than I let on." I smiled. "I know." And that was enough. Later that day, I found myself humming while folding the laundry, not because I was happy exactly, but because my mind had space again. I wasn't carrying the heaviness of being misunderstood. I wasn't editing myself mid-sentence or shrinking beneath someone else's dismissive glance. I was just here, folding warm towels, letting my own voice return in song. That evening I retrieved the scarf pattern from the kitchen drawer, the one I'd used for the original gift. I unfolded it, smoothing the creases, and then I did something I hadn't decided on until that moment. I pulled out the soft rose and cream yarn and began knitting again. This scarf wasn't a replacement. It wasn't an apology. It was an offering, a conditional one, a gesture to say I still have love to give, but now I give it with eyes wide open. Each loop felt like a heartbeat, each row a boundary laid gently but firmly. I would finish this scarf and hold on to it. I wouldn't wrap it. I wouldn't present it as a peace offering. If my granddaughter showed up again, not out of guilt but out of growth, I would decide then whether to give it. And if not, I would keep it. For myself, or for someone else who needed to be held. As the yarn slipped through my fingers, I realized I no longer feared being alone. The old fear had always whispered, "What if you give everything and end up with nothing?" But now I had faced the truth. I had given everything, and I had ended up with almost nothing. And yet, I was still here, breathing, creating, loving, choosing. So the fear was wrong. You don't disappear when others stop seeing you. You disappear when you stop seeing yourself. And I had found myself again in flower stems and lemon cake and cello music and late-night candlelight and the softness of yarn drawn slow through the hands. I no longer needed to be the giver who never asked the mother, who never paused the woman who only felt valuable through sacrifice. I could just be me. It was late afternoon when I received the card. No return address, just my name in shaky cursive, and a smudge of blue ink where the writer had hesitated. I opened it slowly, careful not to tear anything, and unfolded the thick paper inside. It was from my daughter. The handwriting wasn't what I remembered. It had always been firm, upright, impatient even. But this had slants and pauses, as though each word had to be coaxed out. Mom, I know I haven't said this properly. Maybe not in years, but I'm sorry. I don't know when I stopped appreciating you. I don't even know why it became so easy to expect things from you without ever thinking about what it cost. I was raised by a woman who gave and gave, and I grew into a woman who took. I think I laughed at that gift because I didn't want to feel guilty. I didn't want to admit you were still trying, and I wasn't. I don't know how to undo that, but I want to try. If you'll let me, your daughter. I set the card down and stared at it for a long time. My hand hovered over the paper, but I didn't touch it again. I didn't know what to feel, or rather I felt too many things at once. There was sorrow, yes. Sorrow for the years that had passed in a fog of assumption. For the dinners where I smiled too much and spoke too little. For the 1,000 small kindnesses that had gone unnoticed, unreturned. But there was also something else, something quiet and warm. Not forgiveness, not yet, but possibility. I rose and walked into the hallway, past the closet where the old family photographs were now wrapped and stored. I stood in front of it, hands at my sides, and took a deep breath. Then I opened the door. I found the frame of my daughter on her wedding day, smiling, unsure, clinging to my arm, as if I were the only thing holding her steady. I looked at that version of her, and saw for a moment the thread between then and now. People change, but not always forever. I brought the photo out and leaned it against the mantel just for the evening. I wasn't ready to rehang it, but I could let it sit there a while like a guest testing the waters. That night I sat down at my writing desk and pulled out a fresh piece of stationery, the one with the pale blue border and the gold foil edges I used to save for holidays. I didn't write much, just a few lines. Dear daughter, thank you for your words. They found their way to a place in me I thought had closed. I'm not ready to forget what's been said or unsaid, but I am open to remembering what was good. That's something. Love, Mom. I didn't mail it right away. I left it on the desk under the small glass paperweight shaped like a rose. I wanted to be sure. Not of her, of myself. I had spent so many years responding instantly, jumping to fix, to forgive, to smooth things over. But now I was learning to let things settle, to give space, even to my own decisions. That week the scarf grew longer. The rose and cream threads were twisting into a soft, warm braid. It lay across my lap like a hush, and each row I added felt like a question answered. I thought again of my granddaughter, of her voice tentative and real. Maybe the letter from her mother wasn't just for me. Maybe it was for her too. A shift, a ripple. If they were trying, truly trying, I would know. Not from words, from presence, from how they showed up, from what they didn't ask for, from what they noticed. Love, I had learned, is in the details. The way someone refills your cup without being asked, the way they remember you don't like too much salt, the way they listen to the silence in a room and ask what it's trying to say. The next day I baked an almond cake, not because anyone was coming, not because I owed anyone a tradition, but because I missed the scent of it in the house. I let it cool on the windowsill like I used to. I sliced a small piece, made tea, and sat by the window as the sun dipped low and turned the yard golden. That evening I wrapped the rest of the cake in parchment, placed it in a tin, and wrote a note. If you want to come by, the kettle's on. I won't wait, but the door won't be locked. I didn't address it. I didn't even send it. I just set it on the table beside the scarf. Some invitations don't need stamps, just open hearts. 3 days later, just as the afternoon sun began slipping behind the willow tree in the yard, I heard the front gate click open. The sound was so faint I might have missed it, except I didn't. My ears, though, dulled to music, and murmurs were still finely tuned to the small noises that come before change. I stayed seated in my chair, fingers resting on my lap, not moving to the window. If they were coming, they would knock. If they weren't, I wouldn't chase. Then 2 soft knocks, hesitant, like someone unsure if they were still welcome. I opened the door to find my granddaughter standing there, hands behind her back, a look on her face that wasn't quite regret, but something near it. She wore a simple sweater, no makeup, her hair pulled back like it used to be when she'd sit at my table and nibble crackers while coloring in books. Behind her, further down the walk, stood my daughter. She hadn't come up to the door. She lingered at the gate as if to say, "This is her visit, not mine." It was the first boundary she'd honored in years. I stepped aside and nodded toward the kitchen. "Come in if you like." She did, quietly. No phone in hand, no theatrics, just a teenager who for once looked like she didn't have all the answers. I had already made tea that afternoon, a habit now more than a plan. The steam still curled above the pot, ready waiting. She sat down at the table and looked around the room like it was a place she didn't remember, but thought she should. I poured her a cup past the sugar and waited. She didn't speak right away, just held the cup and stared at the steam. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small box, roughly wrapped, uneven corners, a string tied clumsily, but sincerely. "I know it doesn't fix anything," she said, "but I wanted to give this to you." I untied the string slowly, deliberately. Inside was a ball of yarn, soft rose, almost identical to the one I had been knitting with. Nestled beside it was a folded note. I found this at a local shop, and it reminded me of the scarf. I don't deserve a new one, but if you ever feel like making something again, I'd like to wear it this time. And if not, I'll understand. I held the yarn in my palm. It was warm, it had weight, and it wasn't cheap, not just in cost, but in care. I looked at her. Her face was open, vulnerable in a way that only youth allows when apology still trembles like new wings. "Thank you," I said simply. "This is lovely." She didn't smile, not fully, but her shoulders softened. She drank her tea in small sips, stealing glances around the kitchen. And then she said something that made me pause. "Mom's not good at this stuff. She's always, I don't know. She gets embarrassed when she's wrong." I said nothing. I'd known that about her mother for decades, but hearing it spoken aloud by the next generation, it felt like a turning of soil. like something buried might be coaxed into blooming. She didn't tell me to come, my granddaughter added. I wanted to. I nodded. That mattered. We didn't talk for long. She stayed for 1 cup of tea and a slice of the almond cake I had wrapped in wax paper just that morning. She took small bites and smiled, really smiled when she said it tasted like Christmas in a warm house. Before she left, she reached out not for a hug, but for my hand. She held it gently, then looked at me with something near reverence. I hope you make the scarf, she said, but if you don't, I'll still remember this. After she left, I stood at the window and watched her walk down the path. At the gate, she met her mother. They didn't speak much. My daughter looked up at the house once, but didn't wave, just placed a hand on her daughter's back and walked her to the car. I didn't feel relief or triumph or sorrow. I felt still. And that stillness, it was full, not empty. Inside, I placed the yarn on the table beside the half-finished scarf. They looked nearly identical, but I knew which row belonged to which moment. I could finish it now if I wanted to, or not. That evening, I lit the candle again and sat in the quiet. No music, no television, just the sound of the house settling into itself. I picked up my pen and added a line to the letter I'd written to myself. You are no longer waiting to be seen. You are the one watching now. I smiled, closed the journal, stood, and in that moment I knew there would be no going back, only forward, softly, quietly, but forward still. A few mornings later I awoke before the sun, not because of pain or restlessness, but because something inside me felt quietly alive. The air was still dark, but I could sense the day coming, the way the light waits beneath the horizon, gathering its breath before rising. I wrapped myself in my robe, padded barefoot into the kitchen and brewed tea without turning on any lights. The kettle's soft whistle broke the hush gently like an old friend saying, "We're here, we're still here." I carried my mug to the window and watched the sky shift from blue-black to silver, then to a pink so tender it almost hurt to look at. And for the first time in years, I felt awe, not because something extraordinary was happening, but because something ordinary was, and I hadn't dulled to it. I took my tea out to the porch. The air was cool, and the world hadn't fully stirred yet, just the wind and the birds, and the occasional creak of branches reaching toward the light. And in that stillness, I felt it again, that inner turning, that soft kind of power that comes not from what you do, but from what you no longer feel, the need to explain. I had begun to understand something deeply. Letting go doesn't always look like a slammed door or a grand speech. Sometimes it's simply waking up and realizing you no longer carry someone else's noise in your chest. I thought of my daughter, of her letter, of her face behind the gate. It wasn't bitterness I felt, it was distance. Not the cruel kind, but the kind that makes space for air, for truth, for quiet. She had reached out, and maybe that was the beginning of something. But I didn't need to name it yet. I didn't need to define our relationship again, just because she'd extended a hand. Rebuilding was not a duty. Trust once unraveled took its own time to weave again. And I was in no rush. After breakfast, I sat at the kitchen table and opened the drawer where the will rested. I didn't take it out this time. I just laid my hand over it as if to say, I see you. I know you're there, but you no longer govern my days. That decision who would receive what and why had been important. It still was, but it no longer consumed me. I had chosen. I had acted. And now I was simply living. The scarf was finished later that afternoon. I bound off the final row and held it up to the light. It was soft and warm, long enough to wrap twice around the shoulders. I folded it carefully and placed it in a wooden box I'd lined with lavender sachets. I didn't address it. I didn't even leave a note. If it stayed with me, that would be fine. If it found its way to my granddaughter, that would be fine too. It existed, that was enough. In the days that followed, small joys began returning to my world. I replanted the herb garden out back, rosemary, thyme, and a small patch of mint. I painted a new coat of white on the porch railing. I baked bread, real bread, the kind that needs kneading and waiting and faith. The phone rang less, and when it did, it was never urgent. Sometimes it was Marta asking if I wanted to go to the market. Sometimes it was Leonard offering to bring over the crossword puzzle from the paper he subscribed to. Simple things, easy companionship, nothing loud. And one Sunday Helen dropped by, just appeared at the gate with a Tupperware of chicken stew and a grin on her face. "You looked like you could use company," she said. I didn't tell her I'd been hoping someone would. I just opened the door. We ate in the garden. She asked me about my knitting. I asked her about her new dog. And when we finished our bowls, we didn't rush to clean up. We just sat in the shade and watched the bees hover over the mint. It wasn't a holiday. It wasn't a birthday. It wasn't a scheduled visit. It was just two women sitting in peace. And in that peace, I remembered who I'd always been. The girl who loved lilacs. The young mother who made soup from scratch. The wife who learned how to fix a broken lamp with just a screwdriver and hope. The woman who even now found strength in silence. The house felt different now. Not bigger, not smaller, just mine. I had reclaimed it not through fury, not through force, but through presence, through deciding day by day what belonged and what didn't, who stayed and who no longer had a key. And most importantly, I had reclaimed myself. Not the mother, not the provider, not the afterthought. Just me. And she was still here. A month passed, then two. The weather turned warmer, and the sunlight stretched longer into the evenings. I began walking again, just small loops around the neighborhood, slow and steady, like someone relearning how to move with no weight on her back. Neighbors waved. A few even stopped to chat. The world felt softer than it used to, not because it had changed, but because I had. I no longer moved through it, trying to be useful, trying to be acknowledged, trying to catch someone's gaze. I walked like I belonged to myself. The scarf remained in the box on the shelf, wrapped but unsealed. I glanced at it now and then, but I didn't feel urgency. That scarf, like everything else now, was no longer a demand. It was a choice. And I had learned how to wait without needing. Then one afternoon, just before the rain came, there was a knock at the door. Not a hesitant knock, not a guilty one. This one was even. 2 short taps and 1 long one, like someone who had come not to ask for anything but to offer. When I opened the door, it was my daughter. She looked older, not in years, but in the quiet behind her eyes. The kind of age that comes from realizing you've hurt someone and knowing no quick word will undo it. She was holding a small envelope. She didn't offer it right away. "I wanted to return something," she said. She reached into her bag and pulled out the bottle of lotion, the one she had brought to my birthday in that plastic bag, the one I'd thrown away, but she must have fished out when she took the trash to the curb that day. I hadn't realized she'd kept it. I didn't want it to sit in my house like it meant something. "It didn't," she said softly. "It was never meant to replace you." I looked down at the bottle. The clearance sticker was still on it. "I know," I said. She handed me the envelope then, and for a moment I didn't open it. I held it between my palms like a fragile thing. Inside was a note, just a few lines. "I don't know if I can repair everything, but I want to start, if there's still room." I folded it slowly, deliberately, not to delay, but to give the gesture the weight it deserved. "There's room," I said, "but you'll have to step inside differently than before." She nodded, Not defensively, not with tears, just understanding, quiet like rain settling on dry earth. I stepped aside and let her in. We didn't talk much that day. She helped me make tea. She commented on the changes in the house, the missing pictures, the new white paint, the vase of fresh mint on the windowsill. She didn't question it. She didn't try to reclaim space. She just existed in the new rhythm. That evening she stood in the doorway hesitating. "I know I don't deserve anything from you," she said, "not even this visit. But thank you for letting me in." I nodded. "You're not owed forgiveness, but you are capable of earning trust. That's a different path." She smiled, small but real. Before she left, I reached for the box. I handed it to her unwrapped, just the scarf inside. She blinked, surprised. "I made this one after the first was gone," I said. "It wasn't for you. It wasn't for anyone. It was just a promise to myself. But I think it can be both." She didn't reach for it immediately. She looked at it like it might vanish if she touched it too fast. "Thank you," she said. "No," I replied. "Not thank you. Just wear it. Use it. Let it remind you that care doesn't disappear when it's mocked. It just moves somewhere it can be honored." She pressed it to her chest and nodded. No fanfare, no tears. Just the beginning of something quieter. When she left, I stood at the doorway and watched her walk back to her car, the scarf already around her neck. Her fingers smoothing it once, like she wanted to make sure it was real. That night I slept with the windows open. The breeze carried in the smell of rain and early garden bloom. And in the quiet of that room I realized something. This peace, this calm, this clear sense of who I was, it hadn't come from any apology. It had come from the decision to no longer wait for one in order to heal. I had grieved the old stories. I had written new ones. And I had learned to love without disappearing. There was still space in my heart. But now that space was mine to offer. Not a given, not a right. A gift. I stood at the mailbox in the early morning light, the final envelope in my hand. It wasn't heavy, not physically, but it carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of decision. The names, the changes, the new direction of what would remain after I was gone, they were all sealed inside, neatly, quietly, without fanfare. I didn't hesitate as I opened the mailbox and slid it in. The metal door clanked shut, and I let my palm rest against it for a second longer, as if I were placing a stone on a grave not out of sadness, but as a gesture of finality, of release. The will no longer felt like an act of punishment. It had become an act of precision, a way to reflect what was true, not what was merely expected. For so long I had equated inheritance with obligation, my way of saying I still love you, even if that love had not been met. But now I understood legacy is not about guilt. It is about honor. And so I had honored the people who showed up, who gave warmth with no invoice, who held space for me when I felt forgotten. People like Helen Marta and Leonard. Their names were on the pages now, not just because of what they did, but because of how they did it, gently, consistently, without taking. I returned inside and sat at the kitchen table, the morning sun striping across the floor in ribbons of gold. I poured myself a cup of tea, lavender Earl Grey this time, and opened the window to let the breeze in. The scarf my daughter wore now was gone from my home, but the memory of her face that day she left remained. No grand apology, no fireworks, just truth worn like fabric, quiet, soft, tentative. That was enough. She hadn't called again yet. Neither had my granddaughter. But I didn't feel the ache of that anymore. I wasn't waiting. I wasn't on hold. I had already reclaimed what mattered. That same morning, Leonard dropped by. He brought cinnamon rolls wrapped in a towel and a crossword folded in half. He didn't stay long, just sat on the porch and talked about how the pear trees were late this season. We didn't mention family. We didn't need to. Real connection doesn't always need a backstory. Sometimes it's just the comfort of a familiar voice beside you, while the birds chatter and the tea cools. After he left, I walked through the house room by room barefoot on the cool floor. The silence was friendly now, not hollow. The absence of noise wasn't loneliness anymore. It was mine. It was earned. I reached the bedroom and opened the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. Inside were letters, photo albums, and one last handwritten note I had tucked inside a journal long ago. Some endings are just beginnings with the noise turned off. I had written that one night after a long, tearless cry. At the time it had felt like a hope I couldn't yet believe, but now it felt like a memory, like something I had become. I returned the note to the chest and left the lid open for a while, letting the air pass through, letting the scent of old pages and dried lavender fill the room like a gentle sermon. In the quiet of that afternoon, I sat once more at my desk and wrote a letter not to anyone living, not to anyone I'd send it to. Just a letter to what once was. To the woman I was, you did not fail. They may not have seen you. They may not have held your efforts the way you hoped, but you lived fully. You gave completely, and now you rest not in bitterness, but in your own arms. I see you, I thank you, and I will carry you forward with care. I sealed the letter, folded it into my journal, and closed the cover. It was done. The stories they told about me would be incomplete. That was the truth of aging. People remember versions of you that are convenient, comforting, easy to live with, but I would know the full story. And in the end, that's all I ever needed.